Welcome, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the University of Derby. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be in for a fascinating hour and a half or so. I've been really looking forward to this one. I just quickly want to thank Phil Hodgson and the College of Business, Law and Social Sciences for all their work in putting this together. Well, last Friday saw the convictions quashed of 39 former postmasters in the UK. It was Britain's most widespread miscarriage of justice. Some lost their liberty, all of them lost their livelihoods. Others saw their relationships crumble, embarrassment, debt, depression, suicide. So what's it like to be at the end of a miscarriage of justice? How do you deal with those sort of things? And what does all that say about the British criminal justice system? Our guest at the University of Derby for the latest student lecture series will have plenty to say about all of those things. He was given a life sentence without parole for robbery and murder, crimes he didn't do. He spent 12 years in jail before he was finally freed. He was passed from prison to prison, meeting some of the most notorious or most celebrated prisoners along the way. Whilst in prison, he studied journalism and after his release went on to work for the BBC. As a reporter on the Today programme, on Radio 4, on the 6 o'clock news, and on the documentary news series Panorama. Now he hosts a podcast called Second Chance and is the presenter of the Netflix series Inside the World's Toughest Prisons. Hello, Raphael Rowe.
Great introduction. Thank you very much. And hello to everyone at Derby University and everybody else that's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Do you know what, Raphael? I want to start off just by going to that Netflix series. And for those people who haven't seen it, and I'm sure most people here have, I want to play them the trailer for Inside the World's Toughest Prisons, Series 5.
Here's the prison now. This is it.
This place is run by a gang.
My advice to you is do what they say, because they've got their own code of conduct that we have no control over.
My name's Raphael Rowe. I'm travelling the globe to discover what life is really like inside the world's toughest prisons.
Can you give me a tour? I want to know how things work here.
There are no guards supervising these prisoners.
Gang leader, they must obey me.
If you follow these rules, you would get incentives. If not, you will get a disciplinary action.
What's the worst disciplinary action?
You must be very careful what you say.
Our main focus is rehabilitation.
This is the cell block?
Yeah.
It is unsettling. It's too comfortable. You're in for murder.
I think we have to treat them as human beings. I don't think it will get any better if we just lock people up and throw away the key.
We've got to survive, they say.
You're in prison, we are brothers.
It's a war. It's a war against mankind.
We've got no choice, they say.
We grew up in this thing.
I don't want my children to be victims of these people.
Is it the only way?
That is the way it is.
Wow, that's a high energy stuff. And I just want to ask you a little bit about that before we go on to lots and lots of other things. I mean, you go into those prisons and you stay, 7 days as an inmate?
That's right, yeah. I mean, that's the format of the film, that I go in as a prisoner. I'm treated like a prisoner, time with the prisoners. And I learn everything I can about the conditions, about the lives of the individuals, and about the way that the different countries, the different cultures treat prisoners and how they go about punishing and rehabilitating offenders. That's the premise of the program.
And do they know about you when you go in there?
Well, they know as much as we can tell them. A lot of the prisoners don't know my backstory, i.e. that I was a prisoner myself. They generally know that I am a presenter of a Netflix series, but most of them who have been in prison for X amount of years don't even know that Netflix exists because they've not watched it on the outside. So they're told little bits. What they don't know is that when I go in, I don't know anything about them. They don't know anything about me unless it's absolutely necessary. So the production team might forewarn them that I myself have been to prison. That sometimes builds trust. But from the moment I step off of the prison van or the police van and I enter the prison in handcuffs or whatever it is that they chain me up in, nobody knows anything. They just treat me, they're told to treat me like a prisoner. And that's what a lot of them do. In some cases, they go a little bit further than they should go. And then there is a lot of confusion, as you can imagine, because the prisoners see me come in as a prisoner. They do see camera guys behind me, and there's only two. We don't have a team of security or anything like that. So often they tend to think that I'm a prisoner coming into the prison who just happens to be being filmed. And so that's as much knowledge as they get. So once I get into a cell, they treat me just like any other prisoner.
And, you know, the prisoners that you're alongside, they are, you know, top category, aren't they? They're murderers, rapists.
Yeah, these are all maximum security prisons. That's one of the formats of the program. We only go into prisons that are secure and that are maximum security prisons. And so all of these prisoners have been convicted. The majority, there are some that are held on remand, but the majority are in prison for murder, rape, stabbings, you name it, they've been in there. I've met serial killers, I've met lots of different types of prisoners. So these are some of their country's most dangerous prisoners and the most unpredictable of prisoners because of the environment that they're being held in.
Raphael, there's loads I want to ask you about that, and I know our viewers will want to pitch in with their questions about that too. But there's a whole lot to talk about before we get to that. Can we wind back and just tell us your story, really? What's your background?
In terms of growing up, I grew up in an inner city council estate in southeast London, and I had, you know, a normal upbringing, as you would say. I got in trouble with the law when I was in my early teens, run-ins with the law for petty crimes. I call them petty crimes, things that I'm remorseful for now. But that led to me at one point at the age of 20 being arrested and charged with offences that I didn't commit. And that's the kind of beginning of my story. Before that, it was like any other kid growing up on an inner city council estate, you know, facing the challenges that we face. But it was the moment that I was wrongfully arrested and accused for crimes that I didn't commit that my story really begins.
Just before that, though, you talked about petty crime that you're involved in. What sort of crimes, and were you punished at all by the law in your sort of early and mid-teens?
Yeah, I got involved in things like shoplifting. I committed a couple of burglaries, and I ended up getting involved in fights where knives were produced or used, not necessarily by me, but by other people. So I was caught up in an environment where crime was all around me. And yes, I was arrested on a few occasions, and I was put on probation, or I was given community services, which is what I served in the community. I spent a very short time in a young offenders institution for about a month before I was released. So I got a quick, sharp shock of what it's like to be caught up in the criminal justice prison system. So yeah, petty offences for which I was punished and did my time, if you like, for things I did do. You know, these were crimes that I did commit and was doing as a youngster.
You said you were remorseful now. What do you think of what you did back then as a teenager?
I'm remorseful, but I'm not regretful, because I did what I did because it's the environment I was brought up in. If I didn't have something, I wanted the latest fashion, and I didn't have a job, I didn't have any money, so I'd go into a shop and I'd pinch it. Sometimes I'd get away with it. More times than not, I got caught, and so I got punished for doing that. But it was really me being caught up in the environment. That's not an excuse, and as I say, I don't regret it. I did it because I felt it was a necessity. It wasn't. I just wanted what I couldn't afford to get, and so on occasion I stole it. Simple as that.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of people with a similar story to that across the world, but your extraordinary story changed on one night. Tell us about that night and what happened and how it changed you.
I was 20 years old, and I'm going to give you it in that kind of chronological order because it punches the pack, if you like. I was 20 years old, and I had been, as I say, as a teenager, involved in petty crime. But on this particular day, I was woken up by loud noises coming. I was living in a flat with my best mate in southeast London, and I was woken up by loud noises when I was confronted by police officers with guns pointed at me, wearing balaclavas. They were threatening to shoot me, and they were arresting me at the same time. So I was arrested at gunpoint by the police's S19. It's the kind of elite firearms squad. I was dragged from my flat. I was alongside a number of other people, and I was taken to a police station under escort. It was crazy at the time. You know, outriders, lots of police cars, lots of sirens, lots of media attention around this particular crime because it was dubbed the M25 crimes. This was back in 1988. I was 20 years old. And when I was in that police station, I was interrogated and questioned about a murder and a series of robberies that a gang had been committing in and around the M25, hence the reason it was called the M25. So when I was sitting in that police station, I was being asked these questions. As terrifying as the arrest was, as terrifying as it was to be sitting in that police station being accused of something I knew I didn't commit, I was also relieved, if you like, because I knew that they were asking me questions about things that I hadn't been involved in. So that gave me some comfort, but it was still a terrifying experience. But within 2 days of being arrested and accused of being involved in a murder and a series of robberies, I was actually charged with that murder and with these series of robberies. And that involved 3 men hijacking a car, attacking the occupants of the car. One of the occupants died as a result of a heart attack. The same 3 robbers, perpetrators, stole that car and went to a second offence where they burgled the house and stole the jewellery, the diamonds from that property, and then stole the cars from that particular crime and went on to another crime. So this is the 3rd crime in one night. And they also ransacked the house of those occupants and stole their belongings. 3 days later is when I was arrested for those crimes. Now, I didn't and wasn't involved in those crimes, but when I was being accused of these crimes, it was a terrifying and horrible experience to be sat in that police station being accused and then being charged and being sent to prison. Now, when I left the police station after the 2 days of interrogation, I went to Brixton Prison, and it wasn't just a prison, it was a prison within a prison. So I was the highest category prisoner you could be. I was an ACAT prisoner. You have A, you have B, you have C. I was an ACAT prisoner, and I was taken to Brixton Prison. I was 20 years old. It was an adult prison. And I was walked through, I remember being walked through the corridors of the normal prison population, if you like, and taken to these iron stairs. And I had to walk up these iron stairs with 2 guards, 2 prison officers beside me, plus another guard with a dog, because they deemed us to be such dangerous prisoners. And I walked up these iron stairs and bang, bang on the door, the slot opened, a prison officer's face peered out. They opened the door, I stepped inside, that door shut, and then another door, I say door, I'm talking about a steel door, opened, and I was then put inside a cell 6 by 9 in Brixton's prison within a prison, the most maximum security prison in this country at the time. This is back in 1988, charged with murder and a series of robberies.
Well, I'm a bit open-jawed at that. I mean, that is incredible, isn't it? I mean, the shift from your lifestyle to going into prison and maximum security prison, and as you said, a prison within a prison. I don't know how you get your head around that. What was that first day like when you suddenly went from, yeah, I've been picked up and I'm being questioned, but I didn't do it, so I'll get released eventually, to suddenly, you know, being walked through there with the prison guards and the dog, and knowing that this is now a fight for you? What's going on in your head?
Well, it's a bit cliche to sort of say it was my worst nightmare, but it really was. I mean, when I was in Brixton Prison within a prison, I was in that cell, I wanted to cry. I mean, anybody who finds themselves in a situation similar would want to cry, but I didn't. I didn't cry because the enormity of what was happening to me was unbelievable. It was torturous and it was very painful. And I remember sitting in that Brixton prison cell on the very first day, not knowing what to do next. You know, this is a cell in a prison that didn't have any sanitation. So I had to pee and poo in a plastic chamber pot. I had to consume water from a plastic jug. I had plastic knives and forks and plates. I didn't have any of the amenities that prisoners have today. I'm not saying that makes it any easier, but I'm just trying to stress how the environment that I was put in for the very first time, what it was like. Every day my cell would be opened and I would walk along the corridor with other dangerous prisoners and empty my potty into a recess where 20 other prisoners were doing the same. So their pee and poo would be sloshed into the same spot. We'd rinse it out in the same tap water that we would then use 3 minutes later to brush our teeth. So that was the kind of environment that I was in. It's really difficult to explain what I was feeling at the time, because I was 20 years old. I was volatile. I'd been taken out of my existence, which was basically a happy-go-lucky teenager, still living life, driving a car, having lots of girlfriends, going to parties, clubbing, doing all the things that you try to do. Can't do it on lockdown at the moment, but it's something that as a 20-year-old you do. And so I was living a normal life, and all of a sudden, overnight, I was ejected into this environment that was one of the most scariest things that I'd ever experienced at that particular point. And I was crushed. I hadn't committed the crimes. I'd been charged with crimes that I hadn't committed and knew that I hadn't committed. And so I was crushed, and I turned from a 20-year-old almost to a grown man, if you like, overnight in that prison cell for the very first time.
Where do you go for help? Who do you look to? Is it family and friends? And how do they feel about all of this?
It's a very difficult time, because being a category A prisoner, you don't have access to your family. You don't have access to anybody. At the time I was taken from my flat and taken to the police station and taken to the prison, I only came into contact with one other person, and that was the duty solicitor. The solicitor who sort of came in my cell for 5 minutes, said he was the duty solicitor, that he was going to represent me, and he was my only hope. And I was almost holding on to his suit jacket, if you like, asking him to find out what was going on. But as soon as he came, he went. And I didn't see my family, I didn't see my friends, I didn't see anybody for the first few months, because in order for people to come and visit me and support me, they had to get permissions from the Home Office, and that just wasn't happening because the police were still conducting their investigations into these crimes, despite the fact I'd already been charged. So I was very much alone. I was on my own. The only people around me was, as I say, these other very dangerous prisoners who were being held in Brixton's prison within the prison during the time that I was there. So there was no help. I was on my own, and I had to do this by myself.
And are you thinking at this time, okay, I'm on remand now, the trial will come, and at the trial all this will fall apart and I will be a free man again?
It's far more complicated than that, because I was, one, held on remand for 18 months. Two, the documentation from the Crown Prosecution Service and the police was sort of sent to me in piecemeal, if you like, bit by bit. I was in this cell. I was already trying to reach out for help with solicitors and my family. And bit by bit, I started to read the documentation, if you like, in this prison, where I started to get or put together a picture of what it was I was actually being accused of. And as I was reading the documents and I was seeing things like, for example, the victims of the crimes describing the perpetrators as 2 white men and 1 black man, and I knew that myself and the other 2 men that had been charged were black, it was quite clear on the documentation that we were not responsible for these crimes. So as much as that was something that gave me hope, it was also depressing, because how could 3 black men be locked up in prison when the crimes were perpetrated by 2 white men and a black man? It just wasn't justice. Something was seriously wrong, but nobody was doing anything about it. And when I say nobody, I mean the prosecution service, the criminal justice service, even my solicitors who were trying to do something couldn't do anything because the power wasn't with them. It was with the prosecution service. So for 18 months, as those documents kept coming and the evidence was pointing away from me, the torment of being wrongfully imprisoned, waiting to go on trial, was even more torturous. But you're right, eventually we did get to the #1 court at the Old Bailey, where our trial was played out and I was convicted. I was convicted of the murder and the robberies and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And I say that because when you're in prison protesting your innocence, unless you accept your guilt, you won't be released. Not in the day that I was in prison anyway. So that was what was hanging around my neck all that time.
So when you're on remand, is there pressure for you to drop it and just accept that you're in there and that you did the crime?
There's no pressure. I mean, that's what people who are guilty do. They could protest in the police station all day long, and then when they face the reality, if they're guilty, they accept their guilt. I was not guilty. So every day that I was in that prison, within the prison, I was resisting the regime. I didn't come out of my cell for more than an hour every day. And when I did come out of my cell to empty my piss pot or to go on exercise, it was still within the prison. So I'd go out onto a small cage. All the other prisoners around me didn't go out at the same time, so I was on my own. So for 18 months, I sort of socialized with myself, my own mind and my own thoughts. And that was a really, really tough time. Being an A category prisoner meant that every time my cell door opened, a prison guard would be there to greet me. And they carried a little blue book with the big letter A in red stenciled on top of the book, categorizing you as an ACAT prisoner. So if I went to the recess, they'd make a note that at 6:45, Raphael went to the recess. If I went on exercise yard at X time, Raphael went on exercise. So every movement I made was logged in this little book, as they kept a record of everything that I did. And so the whole time that I was held on remand was me fighting my case, because after a few months and I'd seen my family, I started to gather the support of people who started to believe me. I sat there in my cell with my pen and paper and the books that I got from my lawyers and dictated every note, every piece of information that I possibly could to try and draw attention to the inconsistencies in the case, the most important one being the descriptions of the perpetrators, which is obvious.
How much do you feel that there was a racism element to it, or how much was it that there was such a high profile case that the police were under pressure to take anyone down with it?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I mean, we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement today. We've seen what's happened in the George Floyd case. I mean, that was happening back in 1988. When I was arrested and charged, the Crown Prosecution Service had only been in existence for about 2 years. Before that, the police were responsible for arresting, charging and prosecuting offenders. And they had a notorious reputation of fitting people up. And that's what was happening in my case. So we were being fitted into the crime that we didn't commit. But it's pretty obvious how racist our case was, given the fact that the victims of the crimes were not getting justice because they described to the police. Now, there are questions about the reliability of witnesses, but when you're talking about 3 different crimes at 3 different locations, and all the victims of those crimes were describing the perpetrators as 2 white and 1 black man, there's surely something seriously wrong going on when you've got 3 black men charged with the crimes. The victims went so far as to describe one of the white men as having blue eyes and fair hair. I had dreadlocks at the time, and I've got brown eyes. My co-defendant had dreadlocks at the time and had brown eyes. And my third co-defendant was very dark-skinned with short brown hair. So none of us fitted the descriptions on colour. None of us fitted the descriptions on detail. So it's pretty evident that we were being fitted into a crime that we didn't commit by the racist police force at the time that were responsible for investigating. That's the first combination. The second combination is that when these crimes were committed and the news headlines were calling for hanging to be brought back for the men guilty of these crimes, and the headlines were daily after the crimes talking about how dangerous society was with this gang on the loose. Once the police had us in the police station, it was easy for them to get away with charging anybody because the media did play an important role in convincing the general public that guilty men had been arrested. That is 2 combinations that is very, very difficult to beat.
Just want to take you back as well. You said that when you were in prison, you were resisting the regime. What do you mean by that?
And when I say that, I mean for 12 years. It wasn't just whilst I was on remand. So even after I'd been on remand and I was convicted, and I went to the convicted prisons, the maximum security prisons, there is a requirement, there's an expectation of convicted prisoners to conform, to go to work, to jump through the hoops that are expected of them, to do the work that the system dictates that they do. And I wouldn't do any of that. So, for example, when they open my cell door in the morning and they'd expect me to get up and, get in line with the other convicted prisoners, I'd refuse to do that. The consequence was that prison officers would come into my cell and drag me out of the cell and take me down to isolation or segregation. And this went on for years. Not only was I dragged out of my cell and placed in isolation and segregation, but I was often given a good kick-in as part of that process because I just wouldn't accept what was happening to me. I wouldn't accept that I was a guilty man in prison for a crime that I didn't commit. And so that meant when they wanted me to do something, when they wanted me to go somewhere, I just wouldn't do it. And so I suffered severely as a consequence.
And what way do you say you suffered?
I was beaten by prison officers. I'd be stripped naked. I'd be put in an isolation segregation cell, which is in what we call the block. It's sort of in a separate part of the prison where everything's quiet and nobody sees or hears anything. And I would often endure physical beatings by prison officers. So I'd be taken into the cell and I'd be given a good kicking. Once they stripped me naked, I'd be beaten, not on every occasion, but on numerous occasions. I would get beatings because I was resisting. I was refusing to do what they expected me to do. Sometimes it would be as simple as they would demand that I go to work. I'd refuse to go to work. They put me on internal report and then I'd sit in front of the governor for the 100th time. They would expect me to give my prison number, which was MP 3660. So in front of the governor during adjudication, the first thing you're supposed to do is give your number. And I'd refuse to give my number. That would add a day of punishment onto my sentence, if you like, my internal sentence. So as I say, Mark, every time and throughout the years that I was in prison, I resisted the regime. I mean, so it got so bad in Wormwood Scrubs on one occasion. I was beaten so badly by the prison officers that I had a conference with my barrister, who was Michael Mansfield, a leading barrister in this country, the following day. And it was only by chance that I had that legal conference already set up. So when I was taken out of the segregation block to go and meet with my legal team, he saw the blood and bruises all over my body because I refused to allow the system to clean me up, which they often would do. And because he saw the blood and bruise from the beating I'd got the night before, he was able to make a complaint. A few years later, I was compensated for that beating and for what I endured in that particular prison, but it happened in many other prisons where it went unwitnessed.
What kept you going in, knowing you're innocent, but having to suffer all this stuff?
I refused, as I say, to conform to the regime, which made my time a lot harder than it does a convicted man. I kept physically fit. That was my only redress, if you like. That was the only thing that kept me sane. But deep within me, where that anger, that bitterness sat, was the resilience. It was building within me because I was so angry and so volatile. I was 21, 22, 23. Because I was so young, so volatile and so angry, I was able to channel that into hope. And it was the hope that got me through the years that I was in prison. Not just the hope, but I self-educated myself around the law. So I would read the Archbold as if it was a novel over and over again. Archbold being that kind of legal Bible where all cases are referenced. And I would sit in my cell for months on end, going through the various documents that were used against me, the witnesses that had given statements, and I would cross-reference and do everything. On one occasion, I was excited because I got hold of a typewriter. We talk about computers and access to email and the internet. When I was in prison, it was a basic tap, tap, tap typewriter. So I would write documents, 50, 60, 100-page document complaining of my wrongful imprisonment with a typewriter, and that would take months to get through. And the pen and paper, that was the only other weapon. We talk about it being the most important, and for me, it was. But I spent years and years and days and weeks and hours and minutes going over the documents and noting every inconsistency or issue. And then I'd get into conflict with my barristers and my solicitors because I would be insisting that they do things for me that they just couldn't practically do. Not like they do in the American system where, you know, lawyers can go out and make their own investigations. That doesn't happen here in the UK. So I become quite annoying to my legal team, hence the reason I went through quite a few lawyers in the years that I was in prison. But in answer to your question, it was the deep-rooted anger within me that grew hope and resilience that got me through those 12 years in prison.
I've got a few questions coming in from people watching, and thank you for watching this University of Derby student lecture series. Raphael, you've probably answered this, but did you witness anything shocking in prison? I mean, you've told us about some stuff there. Is there any other things you'd like to talk about there?
One of the first, I can talk about lots, but one of the first things that I witnessed that was horrifying, after I'd been convicted and I'd gone through Wormwood Scruffs and suffered this physical beating myself, I was transferred to another maximum security prison up in Leicestershire called Gartree, which is where I met some of the most high profile cases, you know, the Reggie Crays of the world, the Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four, the Winston Silcotts. These are all high profile prisoners or celebrated miscarriage of justice cases, which eventually they became. And when I first turned up at that prison, I remember, because I refused to conform with the regime, sometimes I'd be let out of my cell to just go and sit down in the association area. And I was down in the association area on one occasion. There was a young black guy, he must have been about 21, 22 years old. And I was sitting down and he was sitting down. All of a sudden there was a scuffle. And before I knew it, this young black guy was being dragged out of where I was sitting. I got up, put my back against the wall so I could see everything that was around me. And they pinned this young black boy on the floor and they poured boiling hot water over his face. And he was quite a dark-skinned young man. And the skin of his face completely peeled from his face and you could only see the flesh underneath. And then they proceeded to pour sugar on top of his face so it would cause him even more damage. I later found out that he was a convicted rapist, and that's something that I witnessed on more than one occasion. On another occasion, years later, I remember being released from my cell. I was able, in the time that I was in prison, to secure one of the most comfortable jobs because I refused to do anything else, and that was to become a gym orderly. So because I was physically super fit, and that was the only thing I did was to look after my own physical health, because that helped me get through, I was able to secure a job in the gym. And on one occasion, I was let out early, as you do, to go and prepare the gym for the guys coming in for their session. And I remember walking past the cell of a guy that I knew, and he was hanging in his cell, and I could see his feet kicking. And so I immediately ran into the cell, grabbed his feet and lifted him up and saved his life. We got him down from the noose and he begged me not to tell the authorities. Now, on that occasion, you would expect that the authorities would step in, find out what traumas he was going through or what his concerns were so that they could help him. But he was more scared of them finding out that he attempted to commit suicide, that there was nothing more I could do. I saved his life and I moved on. But for the rest of that day, I couldn't get that image. Even now, I can't get images like that out of my head. And those are just two occasions, but you can imagine that I saw a lot worse in the 12 years that I was in prison.
Yeah, incredible. Maram Ahmed is asking, did they compensate you for what they did? Give you money, support for your mental and physical well-being? This is eventually after your release.
Well, the first thing I would say is that no amount of money could compensate me for the whole of my 20s being inside. And I suspect a lot of your viewers and listeners today are in their 20s, studying, living their lives. All of my 20s were in a 9x6 maximum security cell, 21, 23, 25, 29, up until I was 32 years old. But when I did get out of prison, I was one of the last miscarriage of justice cases where I was compensated financially. But as I say, no amount of money could repay all of the 20s that I lost in prison. It did make my life slightly more comfortable in that I didn't have to worry about buying Happy Shopper beans. I could buy baked beans, or I could buy slightly better products than what I could afford to buy while I was in prison. And it just took some of the stress. But there was no offer of therapy or anything like that. The compensation that I was given was supposed to be used to pay for any kind of therapy or treatment that I needed to overcome the trauma and the damage of being in prison I endured.
What about at night then, for those 12 years? What goes round in your head?
It's freedom, the hope that tomorrow would be the day. I mean, I was often looking at weeks ahead because nothing happened overnight in prison. It was I can't stress enough. It was the anger in me, and I'm a very different person today. But when I was in prison, I was very militant. I didn't really socialize with other prisoners. I didn't make any friends. I mean, of course, I socialized with guys, but not on the same way that convicted guys would come together and have a common purpose. There was a few of us, Paddy Hill being one of them. He was convicted of the Birmingham Six, pub bombings. He was another angry man. It was people like him that I was drawn to because they'd already endured many years in prison. It was those guys, I would say, people like Paddy Hill, Winston Silcott, who was convicted of the Tottenham 3 murder of a police officer, PC Blakelock. These individuals who were fighting their convictions kept saying to me, this young, volatile man, you can't do it the way that you're doing it, i.e. spending months in isolation and in segregation, that I have to campaign. So it was those guys who helped me think differently. Before it was just painful, it was just hurtful every night, sleeping in this bed that was bolted to the floor, made of iron. But they made me think that if I could campaign. So there's one thing, me going through the documentation, trying to fight the legal argument, but there was another thing, compiling a campaign with my family, my sisters in particular, on the outside. So my mind, my thinking shifted once I was educated, if you like, by others who have already been going through what I was going through, because you often think that you're on your own and that it's only happening to you. But fortunately for me, or unfortunate for them, is I was around people who were in the same prison as me, who were going through a similar thing and had been in that position for years, so they could help guide me, this very young, volatile man, about thinking differently. But you know, in answer to your question, every day was a painful thought. You know, is it going to happen tomorrow? Is something going to happen tomorrow where they will come and recognize that they made the mistake? Will I get my next appeal? Will the Home Secretary make a decision that can impact on my wrongful conviction year after?
How do you protect your mental health when you're going through that?
You don't. You allow it to go. For me, I allowed it to go in the direction that it wanted to go. And if I was suffering, I let people know that I was suffering, and I would act out. So I could be quite volatile and lash out. I got into many fights with prisoners. It was the physical, it was the ability to do physical exercise for me that kept my mind sane. If I could do press ups and sit ups and burpees, and it was all kind of bodily exercises, then that would help keep my blood flowing, which would then feed my brain. But it was more about the documentation. Every time I was struggling, and I struggled on many occasions to get out of bed because it was so heavy, the weight of what I was carrying, the weight of what I was trying to do, which was fight the criminal justice system. That was so heavy at times, it was impossible to get out of bed. And for that, I would get punished because, as I say, they would deem that as something that was resistant to the regime. But I did, by becoming physically strong and also helping others. I spent a lot of my time in prison as the gym orderly, helping other prisoners overcome their stresses and strains. You know, these are men that had killed, these are men that had murdered their own wives or had been involved in serious offences, and they were living their lives very different from me because they had to live with the guilt of the crimes that they committed. And I'm talking about people that are remorseful of the crimes that they committed. And so that helped me. Seeing other people suffer for things they did do was for me a reminder of what life could be like for somebody who's guilty in prison.
I've got a question from Chris Kennedy here. He's saying, what advice would you give to all youths out here and to those who suffer the same injustice as you did?
There's no one set rule of advice for young kids. It's all dependent on their circumstances, their upbringing, their environment. I mean, we talk about, you know, dealing with knife crime. I've made documentaries where I've met individuals who think they're carrying a knife for a defensive purpose, purpose is the right thing to do. We all know that knife cuts meat, knife penetrates skin. So carrying a knife is the wrong thing to do, full stop. And my advice would be for those practitioners who work with these kids is to understand more about why they do what they do, and try and penetrate that problem rather than trying to address an issue that is unaddressable. That's what I would say. Anybody who finds themselves in a situation like I found myself in, there is no advice. What advice can you give to somebody who has no power? What advice do you give to somebody who is being accused of a crime that they didn't commit? There is nothing apart from telling them to hold on to whatever it is. For me, it was hope. I remember having a conversation with Kate Botley, who is a priest on a pilgrimage, and she was saying to me that my hope that kept me going in all the years that we're in prison was religious. It was God. And I'm like, well, no, it wasn't. You know, it was the pain in my tummy, those butterflies that you get that I had for 12 years consistently, that helped me through. There was no divine intervention, if you like. And so my message to people who are going through the same thing is to seek support, of course, from everybody and anyone who is prepared to listen to you. But beyond that, it's your own endurance and resilience that will get you through or help you overcome the next hurdle, whatever that hurdle might be.
Another question, has your past being wrongly convicted led to your current career path? And I guess in some ways it did. Did it? Because you studied journalism in prison.
Well, I studied journalism in prison to use the media to highlight my wrongful conviction. So I was in Gartree prison at the time, and I started a correspondence journalism course because, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, the media played a significant role in me being railroaded and wrongfully convicted. And so I knew and learned that I needed the media to start telling the other side of the story. I needed to change the narrative of me being a guilty black man in prison for a crime I didn't commit, or for a crime I committed, which is what the media was saying. So I embarked on this journalism course so that I could learn how to manipulate, if you like, journalists so that they would start writing the other narrative. So that's why I embarked on my journalism career in prison. Of course, what I suffered in prison has made me the man that I am today. There's no doubt about that. I'd probably be a different person. Maybe I wouldn't, who knows? But there's no question that what I went through has given me the resilience to stand up for myself and for other people and to do what I've done in my career as a journalist. For example, when I sat in my prison cell and read every document and every line of every document over and over and over again, and then made notes, I learned a skill, research. I learned that meticulous investigative kind of trait that I then used when I became a journalist. Now, when I was out and I was working for the Today program or for Panorama, I was so meticulous in what I did because I didn't want to get it wrong. Because if I got it wrong and accused somebody or some corporate of some wrongdoing, I would be doing to them what had happened to me simply by writing something or reporting something. So I was very careful. So that's one of the tools that I was able to take out of this wrongful imprisonment and my time in prison into the world as a journalist.
And while you're trying to prove your innocence, what are the fellow inmates? What is their relationship with you or the prison officers? Are they supportive or do they dismiss you?
Initially, they dismiss you because every prisoner who goes into prison, or this is what people say, complain of their innocence. So prisoners are not interested. They've got their own burdens and weights to carry. Prison officers, you know, they are to treat you like a guilty man, regardless of whether you say you're innocent or not. So for many years, prisoners wouldn't listen to me. I mean, there were some, and I met one or two guys in the early part of my remand and convicted sentence who were sympathetic to my cries of innocence, but the majority were not interested, not because they didn't believe I was innocent, but simply because they had their own burdens. And too many other prisoners will complain about not necessarily being fitted up or fitted into a crime, but that the crime that they'd been convicted of wasn't quite the crime that they did, and they're doing a sentence that they shouldn't be doing because they haven't been punished accordingly, etc., etc., etc. It wasn't until I'd studied journalism. I started getting articles in the Independent or the Guardian or other newspapers that people started, and when I say people, prisoners and prison staff started to pay attention, because it wasn't me saying it anymore. All of a sudden, a journalist was writing an article. I remember being in one of the prisons, and a prison officer slid a newspaper under my door. It was the Independent. It was one of the new publications, if you like, when the Independent first came out back in '93, something like that. And he slipped this Independent newspaper under my door, and I opened it up, and the middle spread was, "Is this man innocent?" It was like a bolt of something coming through my cell bars, and not much light could get in because it was bars and bars. But what little light did come in hit that paper, and it made me feel empowered that I'd reach the audience that I'd been so desperate to reach in all the years that I'd been in prison. Somebody else who had influence was now telling people that this young man could be innocent. They weren't saying I was innocent. They were asking the question, is he innocent? Because they took the time and trouble to find out more about my case. And so that was significant and helpful. And then it kind of snowballed. You know, documentaries were starting to be made. The ITV London programme questioned the safety of my conviction. The BBC Rough Justice programme made a documentary with Kirsty Walk questioning the safety of my conviction, unearthing new evidence. So all these things combined convinced prisoners and prison staff that this man, who has been complaining of his innocence in all these years, may well, in fact, be innocent. And that makes a huge difference to how I am received in prison by other prisoners and prison staff.
So I guess you get a sense that the momentum is starting to go your way. Can you just talk us through the sort of final months or weeks and how it was that you finally got your freedom?
I was in Maidstone prison. I was banged opposite Reggie Cray. We all, I'm assuming most people know who Reggie Cray is. He's passed away now, but I was in Maidstone prison. Lots of notorious prisons. There's the Freddie Formers, the Richardsons, the sort of notorious gangsters that we know of, Reggie Cray being one of them. And I remember him writing in his book once that I was the only person. He'd been in prison for 30 odd years. He'd met them all, knew them all, seen them all, and had heard it all. But I was the only person that he ever wrote about in his book, declaring that I was the only man that he'd ever met in prison who he truly believed was innocent. And that's because we were banged up opposite each other, 3 meters apart, for like 3 or 4 years. And he'd see me every day come out of my cell like a military soldier and march down the landing with my folders under my arms, going to wherever it was I was going to do more digging into my case. And this is years on. I was then moved from Maidstone prison to Kingston prison because the prisoners and the prison staff there almost transferred me as a footballer. I was quite a good footballer, and where I could, I'd play football in prison. But Kingston prison in Portsmouth was the only prison in the country that had a football team, a grass football pitch, and a football team where they competed in a league, a non-professional league, obviously. And so although I was moved to Kingston because it was my time to be moved to Kingston, which was a prison that only housed lifers. In other words, everybody in that prison was a murderer or convicted of manslaughter. And although I was moved by the system, everybody kind of deemed it as Raphael's being transferred like Ronaldo would from Madrid to Juventus. But I ended up at Kingston prison. It was like no other prison. So I'm sort of, I don't know, 9-10 years into my wrongful imprisonment. And I got at Kingston prison, and within a few months, I became the captain of that football team, and we competed with outside teams. Obviously, we had no away games. Our goalposts were the only goalposts in the country that were painted blue. Obviously, the walls were white. And so if you had the white goalpost, you wouldn't see the goal. So they painted the goals. We got permission from the FA. And that football team was called Manslaughter United for some reason or another. So Manslaughter United was when I really realised that things had changed for me, because the prison system was no longer as oppressive towards me as it had been in all these years. So yeah, the media's turning of my case and the narrative around my case meant that I was moved to a prison that was less oppressive. And it was whilst I was at Kingston prison that me and my legal team had mounted a campaign to the European Court of Human Rights. And it was the European Court of Human Rights who considered my case and unanimously concluded that I'd not been given the right to a fair trial because of the suppression of evidence and also questions about the identity of the perpetrators. So in March 1999, which would have been 9 years in my prison sentence, the Criminal Case Review Commission took the decision to refer my case back to the Court of Appeal. They were put under pressure. I mean, they did their own review and they reached the conclusion that the convictions were not safe and they referred the case back to the Court of Appeal. So whilst I was in Kingston Prison, my case was referred back to the Court of Appeal. It took another 2 years. And in that time, I went on hunger strike to protest at the length of time it was taking, even though they'd now deemed my convictions unsafe. They didn't unlock the door and let me out. They still made me wait for the process to take place, i.e. a date by the Court of Appeal. But in July 2000, and I remember it vividly because the Euros were on, for the very first time, televisions had been introduced to prison cells, so I could sit in my prison cell and actually watch football, and I'm a big football fan, and I was watching the Euros, and the screws came, knocked on my door and said, "You're going to the appeal court." It's a lot more complicated than that, but within days, I was down in Pentonville Prison in London. I was shaking like a leaf, not knowing what was going to happen, as confident as we were. That's me and my legal team and my co-defendant. And we stood in the dock at the at the Court of Appeal, and the judges quashed my conviction, and I was freed.
How does that feel after all that time, that moment? I'm sure you can remember it.
You'd think that I jumped for joy, but I think they'd taken all the joy out of me. I think everything that I knew as a 20-year-old had been taken away. You know, my whole existence had been suppressive for so many years. I'd been hurt in so many different ways. I was 32 years old. I'd never been in love. I'd never done the things that people do in their 20s. I'd never experimented. I'd never drank. I'd never had a bit of alcohol. I mean, they had hooch in prison, which prisoners would make, but it wasn't my thing, you know. So I wasn't exposed to some of the things that you're supposed to be exposed to at your 20s. So yes, I was looking forward to walking out and doing the things that I wasn't able to do. But I was also so scared because while I was in prison, apart from moving from one prison to another in a sweatbox, so in a cubicle inside of a van where you can't feel or see anything, I'd never moved any faster than my feet could take me. All of a sudden, I'm walking down the Court of Appeal steps, getting into the back of a taxi and getting really disorientated because this taxi is moving at 30 miles an hour. And I hadn't moved that fast for 12 years. And that was really uncomfortable. My sister in the back of the taxi handed me a mobile phone. They didn't exist when I was in prison. So for the very first time, I held a mobile phone and didn't know what to do with it. That might sound ridiculous, but it's so true. I just didn't. It was the old Nokia then, you know, none of this flash Apple stuff that you've got today. It was a basic Nokia phone. And for your audience, if you don't know what that is, search it up because it was like a brick. But it was those little things that I had to recondition. One of the most difficult things was opening a door, for example. For 12 years, I'd come up against the door and I'd have to wait for the authorities to put a key in, unlock it, push it open and close it. So all of a sudden, I can make that decision for myself. I could stand in front of a door, reach for a handle, turn it, push it open or pull it open and walk through it and shut it behind me. I'd not been able to do that for 12 years. A very simple condition like that was really difficult to overcome. I have overcome it now, obviously, but at the time when I was released, where I should have been jumping for joy, I was scared because I'd lost the ability to make decisions for myself. I'd lost the ability to interact with people, have conversation. My conversation had been restricted to prison talk, prison slang in all the years that I'd been in prison. So I couldn't talk about what was on telly the night before, although they just introduced televisions. I couldn't talk about what the trendiest trends were at the time because I wasn't exposed to that. I really was inside maximum security prisons where it's difficult to get RISLA papers in, let alone what's going on in the outside world. So adjusting back into society once I'd won my freedom wasn't. I mean, there was a time, don't get me wrong, I ran around like a wild 20-year-old again for a very short period because I was still 20 years old. I'd gone in when I was 20, I came out when I was 32, but in actual fact, I still had the mentality of a 20-year-old. You know, the trends had changed, relationships had changed, people had fallen in and out of love. I'd had none of those experiences, so I had to learn quite quickly how to adjust back into society.
How much do they prepare you for that reintroduction back into society? Do you get clothes? Do you get money? Do you get advice?
When they quashed my conviction, they didn't open the wooden door and I walked down and cuddled my family. No, they take you back down the concrete steps at the back of the Court of Appeal. They put you back in the cell. This is what happened to me. And then they process you. They make sure that there are no outstanding charges, which means that you shouldn't leave prison. And then they gave me a grant. I think it was a little plastic envelope with £54 and the little belongings that I had. And then they opened the Court of Appeal door. So I had £54 in my pocket. That's all I had to my name. There was no sort of reintegration programs like Through the Gate is one of the things that they offer to prisoners today, where they try and find them housing and all that kind of stuff. Because I was an innocent man protesting my innocence, I never went through the probation or the periods where you go through these kind of reintegrating. So after somebody's served 10, 15, 20 years in prison, they tend to work on slowly releasing them back into society so they can adjust. For me, it was overnight. So I had to adjust through my own mechanisms, which, as you can imagine, was problematic. The people that I loved most dearly, my sisters and my family, they remember a 20-year-old. I come out as a 32-year-old who was cocooned in his own existence, and all of a sudden I'm expected to behave in a way that is normal, and it just wasn't normal, a normal environment for me because I'd been institutionalized.
Another question here is from LD Electrical Solutions. A lot of people would never forgive what had happened and be unable to get over it. They'd like to know how you're able to be so positive, so driven after all that you've been through.
I've never forgiven because there's never been an apology. No one's ever come to me and said to me, we're really sorry for what's happened to you. The witnesses that lied or the police that racially fitted me into a crime that I didn't commit. So forgiveness has never crossed my path. And that doesn't bother me because you do or you don't. And I've never had the opportunity to forgive anyone. I suppose for me, it's really been about the opportunities that I've embraced since I've been out of prison. So once I'd overcome making love again for the very first time, or having a conversation with a woman, you know, being able to sleep in the same bed as someone, which was again really, really difficult. You imagine I'm in a single cell, in a single bed, bolted to the wall for 12 years. All of a sudden, I can sleep where I want to sleep with who I want to sleep, if they're willing to sleep with me. And that was really difficult. At first, I had to push beds that I was sleeping in up against the wall because the wall was my comfort, not another person. So those were the kind of challenges that I overcame. But the opportunities, like working for the BBC, distracted me from all of those distresses. And so all of a sudden, within 12 months of being released from prison, I was on an aeroplane heading to Afghanistan. I was smuggling diamonds from Sierra Leone back to the UK as an investigative journalist for the BBC. So I was distracted and so excited. These are some of the most dangerous places in the world. Afghanistan has just gone through a war. This is 2001. September the 11th has not long happened. And here I am in the middle of Afghanistan investigating heroin and the poppy fields, you know, oblivious to the fact that I was in probably the most dangerous place you could ever have gone to in 2001. And so the work that I was doing was so exciting. It was so liberating, if you like, that I was now exposing other injustices, social injustices, is that I was distracted with my own pressures, if you like, and I had a sense of freedom that I didn't have before. That is probably what kept me so positive to this day. You know, I've never really taken the time, if I'm honest, to allow what happened to me in the past to hold me back. I use it to my advantage, and that would be my advice to anybody. Sometimes it's difficult, but if you channel it in the right way, you can use it to your advantage. And I've done that to become a successful journalist.
Got a lot of questions coming in, Raphael, about the criminal justice system and the prison system. Let's look at Prabhat Kaur. Having experience being in different prisons, what would you change about the British criminal justice system?
My simple answer is honesty. I wish the criminal justice system and the prison system were just honest about the problems that they face. And I wish that they would do more to address those problems, because billions, as we know, are spent on the criminal justice system, prisons in particular, every year. So what are they missing? What are they not doing that they can do with that money? And I believe it's being honest with the problems that they face. 80,000 prisoners in prison is a lot, but it's not in comparison to the amount of people we have in the population. And so I think they could do a lot more to address the underlying issues that drives the majority, 60% of these prisoners going in and out of prison. Some of them are going to be challenging, of course, for mental health reasons or other reasons, drugs, etc. But I do believe that if the criminal justice system and the prison system were honest, really honest about the challenges that they face, and they employed people who believed in other people and doing the right thing, that they could make a much bigger difference than they do. You know, I was in the prison system, so I witnessed the maximum security side of things. And there are lots of opportunities, no question, for prisoners. They're just so sporadic, they're not consistent, and they're not driven to the point where they really want to help that individual change. That's my experience.
Just building on that a little bit, Connor Truman's asking, what are your thoughts on the way that UK prisons are run and the criminal justice system in general? And how important is the European Court of Human Rights and disclosure to our justice system?
Let me deal with disclosure first. I spent 12 years in prison because of non-disclosure. The police refused to disclose information about who was paid a substantial reward money in my case. To this day, I've still not been able to obtain that documentation. My convictions are quashed and I've been released, but that documentation and that information has never officially been released. I know that the Daily Mail paid a substantial amount of that money, and I even tried getting the information from them, but of course they didn't reveal that information. So non-disclosure, in my case, going back to 1988, and cases that are going on today, is still a real issue. And that's because we allow the prosecution to decide what is and what isn't disclosed. Look, at the end of the day, if the police mount a case against an individual and the prosecution tend to prosecute that individual, everything that has been gathered in the process of that investigation should be disclosed. It shouldn't be, in my view, the view of the prosecution to decide what's material and what's not material. Everything is material, because what they might not find is relevant, you may discover. And that's what I did in all those years that I was in prison. In terms of what more can be done in the criminal justice system to improve the conditions of prisons, do you know what? I've been, I don't know if it's privileged, to travel the world and look at other prisons. And when I compare those prisons with the British criminal justice system's prisons, they're not anywhere near as bad as many of the places that I've been to. It's not always the prison. You know, prisons are just structures, aren't they? They're just bricks and mortar. It's what you do with the prisoners in those prisons that make a difference. And as I said earlier, they don't do enough. They're not honest with how they are trying to rehabilitate somebody, because you can rehabilitate somebody. Of course, they have to make the decision for themselves that they're ready to change. But if they're given the right support and help, and that's not me bleeding heart for convicted prisoners, I'm just saying the difference between punishing somebody and helping them change their lives is a very fine line. And we just don't get it right in this country for obvious reasons. And that reason is this: if the media say the government are going soft on crime, they've got to pretend that they're hard, and therefore they change systems and regimes that affect people in ways they shouldn't.
One from Riley, because you've seen lots of prisons all over the world in your Netflix work. He's asking, from your experience, which country has the best criminal justice system?
I don't know about their criminal justice systems, because my remit is to look at the prisons, and if that's a reflection on how their criminal justice systems deal with those who make mistakes or commit crimes, then it's got to be the Scandinavian prison system. I've been privileged enough to go to Halden in Norway, where, from the moment you walk into the prison officer shakes your hand, and their whole ethos is to make that prisoner change. And they do almost anything they can to help that individual come to terms with who they are and what their problems are, and they address those problems. So for me, in answer to your question, based on what I've seen around the world so far, Halden do it like no other. They're humane. They treat prisoners with humanity, and it makes a difference because it changes the mindset, especially of those individuals who have felt abandoned their whole life or have suffered in some way, shape or form. And so they make other people suffer as a result. They get cocooned into this environment where the prison do so much to address those problems that they churn out what I believe are rehabilitated offenders. So the Scandinavian system.
A couple of others. Which is the worst? And on a similar line, out of all the prisons that you visited, which was the most shocking and why?
Which prison is the worst is probably the most popular question I get asked from people around the world. And my honest answer is, they're all the same for different reasons. They're all bad for different reasons. I talked just a moment ago about Halden being a humane prison. They have the resources and the facilities to make the lives of prisoners a lot more comfortable than they do in somewhere like Papua New Guinea or even here in Britain. But it's not about the structure. Of course it is. The conditions to some extent make a difference, but lots of countries don't have the resources to provide prisoners with showers in their cells or televisions. But the shower and the television do not change the mentality of a prisoner. It's what you do with that prisoner. I can't emphasize that enough. So for me, it's the mindset of the prisoners that make the prison what it is. And if the prison services in any of these countries can get into the mindset of prisoners, then they reduce the threat of violence, they reduce the need to take drugs. And therefore, when I talk about what is the worst and what isn't the worst prison, of course, I've been to places where prisoners chop the heads off of other prisoners. I've seen the most horrific videos, even recently, of what's happened in Paraguay and Ecuador, where prisoners are sending me videos with phones, illicit phones that they have in prisons, of them actually committing the crime there and then. They're sending me in. So I see some horrific violence from prisoners. And that's because the authorities do not do enough to reduce the need for prisoners to kill each other. Some might say, well, those prisoners are violent and dangerous and they do this. Well, they wouldn't if the facilities and the resources were invested in making them believe that they don't need to do that. So, the worst prison for me is how you treat a prison and how you get into their mindset.
Yeah, you just mentioned Paraguay there. I've recently watched the Paraguay episode that you've done for Netflix, and that was incredible to watch. Prisoners sitting around with knives, openly carrying knives in their hands. I mean, I think if anyone hasn't seen the Netflix series, I'm going to highly recommend watching it because it's a real eye-opener. I've got one from Tom Hunt here. Has your experience of staying in so many different prisons across the world altered your views on punishment and rehabilitation? And from what you've seen, do you think the criminal system's aim of rehabilitation is working, or is it all about retribution?
I think it differs in different countries, and it comes down to, once again, the resources. Has it altered my view? It has, to the extent that I've now witnessed how different places apply what they call rehabilitation. It's so interesting because the first prison I went into when I first decided to do the Netflix series, which I don't hesitate to say wasn't an easy decision, having spent 12 years trying to get out, going back in willingly is not something that most people would want to do. Well, Brazil was the first prison that I went in my Netflix series. And I remember the conditions were horrendous. The violence there, I mean, just a few weeks before I got there, prisoners had lost their lives. There'd been a riot between the two kind of gangs, if you like. Prisoners had had their heads chopped off and they'd been kicked around like footballs. That's what we're dealing with here. But I remember standing with a prisoner who he had his mattress in his hand and he was going off to the love cells, if you like, because they're allowed conjugal visits. And I remember sort of saying to him, okay, this place is horrifying, it's scary, it's dangerous. If you could swap this place for a cell in a British prison, which is much better in terms of its conditions, would you? And he said no, because he gets conjugal visits in Brazil and they don't have it here in the United Kingdom. So he can maintain his love relationship or just his relationship with his wife or his girlfriend or his boyfriend, whatever his preference. And that was more important to him than the conditions. Hence the reason I say it's not about the conditions. So that's about rehabilitation. In terms of punishment, Belize was another place that I went to, and they have this, they kind of indoctrinate prisoners. If any of you have seen the Belize episode, if you haven't, go and watch it, because it's where they use religion as the key to changing prisoners' lives, Christianity, and it works to some extent. A lot of the prisoners whose heads were poked through barbed wire on the floor like dogs, really shocking to see. But they say, you know, God's changed me, made me, whatever. I believe they've been indoctrinated. But the punishment, the other side of that rehabilitation is the punishment. And I went to their punishment cell to talk to a guy, and he's kept in a space that is pitch black, absolutely dark, for 3 or 4 days. He can see nothing. So when they opened the door for me to talk to him through the door, you could see the flutter in his eyes where he couldn't deal with the light that was coming in. And for me, that was horrifying. I spent many months in isolation and segregation without a bed, without anything in the cell except me and the Bible and my push-ups. But I found that horrifying to see. So does rehabilitation or does retribution work? He's angry. He gets more angry when he's in that cell. So what happens next? They let him out after 3 or 4 days, and he's got all this anger pent up. Another prisoner or a prison guard says something to him and he lashes out. And before you know it, you've got a much more serious incident than what it could have been had they punished him, if they had to punish him in the right way. So in terms of rehabilitation and retribution, I think different prisons in different countries do it differently. In some places, they do neither. Locking somebody up is in itself the only option they have. So just keeping them confined in a space somewhere like Paraguay, they just lock them up and then leave them to their own devices. Like you say, they carry knives, they use drugs openly. And when those are taken away from them, the prisoners kick off, as they have done quite recently.
One from Heather Duggan here saying, after spending so long in prison, being wrongly imprisoned yourself, what's drawn you back to working with and for prisoners?
The key is changing people's perceptions. My whole mission now is to change people's perceptions about what prisons are really like, because I think the media and the public's perceptions of prisons, which are these closed environments, are often, for the best part, misleading. And all I'm trying to do, and the reason that I go into these prisons now, is because if I can change the public's perception about prisons, and I believe that that's what my Netflix series is doing, they can challenge the authorities who want to take a particular stance and mislead the public. It's harder to do it here in the UK because our government, I've had lots of access to prisons here in the UK, but do they try to manipulate it in a way that they don't when I go to these other countries. So the reason I go into prisons is because, one, I want to show people how different countries and different cultures deal with criminals and how they run their prisons. But more importantly, it's about changing the public's perceptions about prisons. What are they for? Should they be punishing? Should they be rehabilitating? Is your tax-paying money being wasted by the authorities, or should it be used in a more productive way? So that's my part of my mission for going back in prisons today.
Okay. Megan Bollen is asking, Raphael, do you think the prison system in the UK is still racist?
I wouldn't use the terminology, the British prison system. I would say individuals that work within the British prison system are racist, as they are in other walks of life. You know, you could say the prison system is institutional racist or structurally racist. I believe it's down to individuals. There may be this unconscious bias. We know that a disproportionate number of black people are in prison, but that's more probably to do with the fact, or one of the facts, is that they get caught up in this kind of secondary liability, joint enterprise type of cases where you nick one, you arrest 10, all of them get convicted for the same crimes, and 9 of them actually didn't commit the crime, but they're in prison. That is a flaw in the law. You can use that one, a flaw in the law, which I think disproportionately punishes people of colour, black people, Asian people, ethnic minorities. So I wouldn't say that the prison system is racist, and people will challenge me on that, because the prison system is a construct. Individuals are racist. It might be more than one, it might be 2, it might be people who sit in an office around a table, pulling the strings and making the decisions, you know, the government, in other words, and they have this innate racism within them, and collectively they make decisions that target particular communities. But it's the individuals, and let's be right on that in our terminology. If we can change that narrative to say individuals are racist, because the prison system is just a term and it gets lost when we use terms like that. So when you're writing your next essay, think about the individuals in the positions of powers that are potentially racist or make decisions that can have that kind of effect.
Carla Fletcher has one for you. Do you have any contact with high-profile others who've experienced miscarriages of justice? For example, Amanda Knox. I mean, do people come to you for advice?
On a daily basis, I've never heard from Amanda Knox. I know who she is. I have had lots of people who are currently in prison fighting what they say is a wrongful conviction. I have lots of people who have served time for what they say is a wrongful conviction. They're now out, who approach me for help. But every day I get messages from mums, dads, brothers, sisters, people who say they have loved ones in prison who have been wrongfully convicted and in prison. Now, obviously, because it's a loved one of theirs, they would say that, you might argue. But people don't, do they? People don't generally complain that their loved one has been wrongly convicted if there is no substance to that allegation. So in answer to your question, lots of people on a daily basis message me through social media, on Instagram or Twitter, or through Facebook, or email, asking me for my help for somebody that they are protesting is wrongfully convicted, or even if they are interested in a case where they believe a wrongful conviction has taken place. Most recently, there was a case, or there is a case in Scotland at the moment that was played out on Channel 5 quite recently about a young man who's been in prison for X amount of years. And I was inundated from people in Scotland saying, can I get involved? Boy, I wish I could, but I just can't, not for everyone.
You're a student, and we've got lots of students watching today, but you've gone back to study. Just tell us a little bit about what you're studying, where you're at with it.
I spent many years as a practical journalist, if you like, running around investigating social injustice and injustice. And so I have the practical skills. You know, I've been cut, I carried a knife, I've committed crime, I've been in prison, I've done everything from that side. And you know, the case documents that I fought, but I never really did anything from the academic side. And so I wanted to combine the two. I wanted to broaden my knowledge. And so I embarked on, when I had some downtime, I thought, I'll go and do a criminology course. It's a subject that I find interesting, fascinating. So I embarked on a criminology degree at Birkbeck University. And what it's done, and the reason that I did it is, as I say, to combine my practical skills with the academic skills, bringing them together. And I've learned so much. I finished an essay this morning on joint enterprise, and I've learned so much about the Jogi case, if you don't know about it, and about the, criminalizing of Black and Asian people. and the problems that the criminal justice system in this country, as well as around the world, faces. And so I find it really fascinating. But just being in that space and doing something maybe a bit late in life, it's never too late to learn. And I've learned so much, and I'm so pleased that I'm doing it. But it also gives me another level of credibility, so I can talk from a practical, personal point as an investigative journalist, former miscarriage of justice victim, but then I can talk about it with the same tongue as the academics too, so I can compete with them as well in my argument. That's what I would say.
And are you looking to use it for yet another career? What sort of options are there open to you?
I don't know. I just wanted to combine it with what I'm already doing, but I do know and feel that there is a space for my expertise and pushing that into working with other criminologists or sociologists or whoeverologists there are out there. So I haven't thought about it as another career, but there will come a time where I won't be able to go in and out of some of the world's most dangerous prisons, because I probably won't have the legs to run if it does get any more threatening than what it did in Lesotho. And if you haven't seen the Lesotho, boy, can I move, because when those guys were threatening to take me as their wife, and I could see things happening to me that didn't happen to me in my own time in prison, I made the decision to run for the door and then realize that the door was locked and I couldn't get out. And that's the reality. There is nowhere to go when you find yourself in that situation. So yeah, I think becoming a criminologist at some point when I get to the end would be another useful weapon in my box of armory, if you like.
Finchurch is asking, where do you think the fault lies in cases like yours? Having been through it and having studied now, do you think it's a systematic issue? Is it a political issue, race issue? What do you think?
I don't think it is a combination of those things. Of course it is. But again, like what I said about, racist prisons, it's individuals making decisions that affect the lives of people. There were certain police officers in my case who made their mind up that we were guilty before they investigated the case. And once they discovered evidence that pointed away from me and my co-defendants, rather than accept that as evidence of our innocence, they then tried to move the goalposts. And so I would argue that there is a lot of pressure, obviously, on the police and the prosecution, especially in high-profile cases, to secure convictions. But in your daily run-of-the-mill cases, and that might be murders or rapes or other serious offences, that they're under huge pressure to secure convictions, and sometimes they turn a blind eye. But disclosure is one of the big issues, because it's often disclosure and accessing material is where you find that little chink that proves somebody didn't do it. But it's also equality of arms, isn't it? I mean, that's the bottom line. The prosecution and the police have everything at their disposal. You as a defendant are relying on a competent solicitor who is already under extreme pressures. And that's not me making excuses for solicitors who I think do a fantastic job, but they can't do a fantastic job for everyone. And I wouldn't suggest that they cut corners, but I think their job is extremely hard because they're always playing catch up with the prosecution and the police. We should have a system whereby everything that is gathered is kind of put in a neutral place, so both the defense and the prosecution can access it willy-nilly. And there, I think you will find there would be less miscarriages of justice, because what it is that is found 10 years, 15 years down the line, or even 6 months down the line, would already be available, spotted and used to avoid somebody being wrongfully convicted or somebody being wrongly convicted having their convictions overturned. That's just a piece of what I think.
Just going back to the crimes you were wrongly accused of doing, I've had a few people ask, was anybody ever brought to justice for those?
Nobody was ever brought to justice. The police didn't investigate the case after my convictions were overturned. I think that there are probably still police officers who believe in their heart of hearts that we are still guilty. You know, we took on the system, we beat the system because we were able to prove that they fabricated evidence, that they conspired, but nobody was ever brought to account. What's interesting in my case is there was only, going back to what I said about the 2 white and 1 black man, and then the detailed description of one of the white men from the victims being described with fair hair and blue eyes, and that's quite detailed, you know, that's quite detailed. And they saw this through the balaclava of what the perpetrators were. So they saw the blue eyes as he came face to face. So this is quite descriptive decisions. And by the way, the prosecution at the trial tried to say to the jury, or did say to the jury, that the victims must have been mistaken. That's how they got over it. The only witness in my case that we suspect got the reward money was known as a police informer, was involved in the disposal of the cars that came from the robberies, and was seen by an independent witness. He was the only witness in our case who was handled by the same 2 police officers who handled me. In other words, the police officers who took me in that interrogation room in those 2 days and accused me of being involved in something I didn't do also were the handlers for this particular witness, and he was the only witness in my case who had blue eyes and fair hair. So although nobody ever got charged after our convictions were overturned, I think the police knew from the outset who really was responsible, who they put me in for.
You mentioned names of people in prison. You mentioned Reggie Cray, I know Charlie Bronson, you mentioned Winston Silcott, the Birmingham 6, Guildford 4 around. And you also had an awful lot of time to yourself in prison too. And Alex Ravenel is asking, from all of those things, what is the biggest lesson that you learned in those 12 years?
Oh, here's a cliche, never judge a book by its cover. I think in the work that I do today, I never, and anybody who's watched my Netflix series will know, I think that when I go into these environments, even though I'm uncomfortable in the presence of a convicted rapist, unlike when I'm in the company of a murderer, I never judge. I just allow people to tell me their story, why they did what they did, how they got involved, what they think about what they did. Do they deserve the punishment that they've got? And I think that's one of my biggest lessons, is that I learned so much about mankind. And when I say mankind, I'm not including women here, because I was in an environment pure men. It was always men. So I learned about every movement of a man, every thought of a man, the wicked, the evil, the manipulative, the vulnerable. So every man I came across and spent time with over the years that I was in prison, I like to think are out in the real world and are all capable of committing similar crimes to those that I met in prison. And so that's one of the biggest lessons that I learned, was never to judge somebody based on the fact they only have one eye or they have a long scar down their face. You know, it could be a really simple answer as to why they got that. You don't try and describe that individual as a dangerous person because they've got a scar and they look mean, or they've got one eye, it must have got dug out with a knife. So that's one of the lessons that I learned. The other lesson is be true to who you are and who I am. That's one of my biggest strengths, is that I like to think I'm authentic, I'm honest, I'm direct, and I say it as it is. I do that in my job, I do that in my work, and I believe in something. I believe in right and wrong. I believe in who I am. I don't try to be somebody else. I don't try to look like anybody else, sound like anybody else. I did when I first joined the BBC, as you will know, Mark. When I first joined the Today programme, it was the Queen's English, and that's all they spoke. And I sat down next to people who had spent their whole lives trying to become a reporter on the BBC Today programme. All of a sudden, 12 months after coming out of prison, you've got this dreadlocked, you know, prison slang speaking South Londoner on the Today programme that caused a stir in a lot of the traditional newspapers, who would ask how very dare the BBC employ this person. So I sound a lot different today than I did when I first come out of prison. And I learned a big lesson. I tried to be like a BBC reporter instinctively, because I thought that's what I should be like, and learned quite quickly that's not who I am. And so ever since, I've been true to myself, and that's one of my biggest lessons.
Brilliant. I want to quickly ask you, for those that have not seen the series, if you're to choose one episode to get the taster, to get into the series, which one are we going to choose?
I think if you're looking for rehabilitation, you've got to go to Norway. If you want to see how it should be done and how prisons can be humane, you've got to go to Norway or even Greenland. If you want to see me SHIT myself, you've got to go to Lesotho or to South Africa, because I think both of those prisons show a completely different side. If you want to see, I'm selling them all here, Mark, so there's no one. It's, if you want to see terrible conditions, go to Philippines or Paraguay, and if you want to see violence that is beyond belief, you go to somewhere like Brazil. All of these are part of the Netflix series, and I can't overlook the fact that in Ukraine I met probably one of the world's most prolific serial killers, who in a cage, and interviewed this guy about being a serial killer in the way that he was. He's now dead, but different prisons offer different things. So watch them all is what I say.
Great. Raphael, we've had loads of questions, lots of people watching from all over the world. I just want to thank Philip Hodgson, the Associate Dean for the Centre of Excellence for Policing at the University of Derby. Of course, a big thank you to you. Thanks for being with us today, for being open and honest and giving your opinion on the prison system, the criminal justice system, and all things to do with your time in various prisons across the UK. Raphael Rowe, I heartily recommend the Netflix series. We're all looked at home. It's fantastic. Thank you for giving us such an insight. Thanks for being here. And Raphael, have a good day. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Mark, for being patient with me, listening to what I have to say. And by all means, I encourage your listeners to message me if they have any further questions. If they want to know more about my story, they can read my book, Notorious. They can listen to my podcast, Second Chance, or they can watch the Netflix series. They all offer something different, but I'm approachable, as you can probably see. So you can get me on Instagram, get me on Twitter. And I'm always up for learning something. So if you've got something you want to share with me, share it with me. But thank you so much for inviting me on today. I hope that your audience takes something away from this, especially at a time when we've just gone through this really tough lockdown period. Be grateful for what we've got, because there are plenty of people in a situation that is far worse than your own. That's not me playing down how tricky it is to survive lockdown. But remember, you can reach for that handle, you can turn that, walk in or walk out. Some people can't. Thank you so much.
Great place to finish. Raphael Rowe, thank you so much for being with us at the University of Derby.